Afternoon, as you know, or many of you know, I'm not Ed Kochian. Um, I'm Sean Quimby. I'm director of the Special Collections Research Center here at the Syracuse University Library and treasurer for the Library Associates. I may not be Ed, but if I were Ed, I'd be certain to point out that there is information about Library Associates membership at the rear of the room. Brochures that talk about the perks and benefits of being a member. As well as a calendar of events. And I will point out that in the next couple of months, we have two interesting talks coming up. On Thursday, March 19th, we have Daniel Zittraum, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, talking about Jacob Riis, New York. And on Thursday, April 23rd, we have the Mary Marshall Lecture, which will be Elizabeth and Malcolm Ingram from SU's Department of Drama, talking about the drama in Shakespeare's sonnets. So I've been asked to introduce someone who many of you know probably better than you know me. And in looking at Terry Keenan's CV, I was struck by many things, but one of them is a word that I have really like, and that word is polymath. He strikes me as the ultimate polymath, and in fact, as a librarian, one of the things that I think we all should strive to be polymaths. The appeal of librarianship is the opportunity to obtain knowledge in so many different areas. So it's hardly surprising that Terry Keenan is or was, in fact, a librarian. He spent 14 years as a special collections librarian, earning his MLS here at Syracuse University. But he's also a Zen monk, an artist, and an author. Today he's here to talk about his writing, about his work as an author. He's here to talk specifically about If Our Lives Be Spared, 3 Generations of an American Family in Central New York. He's used his expertise with primary documents to create an intimate account of 80 years in the life of a frontier family in central New York, including its struggles with shifting mores and relationships with the landscape amid transformative changes in technology, transportation, culture, and education. Please join me in welcoming Terry Keenan this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay. Is my voice coming across all right? Okay, good. It's great seeing so many friends and familiar faces. Again, it's been a number of years since we've been back here in Syracuse. The weather has really sat well nicely for us. We came up in our Subaru wondering what kind of roads we might find. I try to tell folks down in Maryland where we live about the North Country, and I say in Syracuse they have as many names for gray as the Eskimos have for snow. Right now it's bright gray. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you today about this book, If Our Lives Be Spared, because it's very close to some of the things that library associates hold close to themselves. It's about the family of Betsy Knapp. And some of you older members may remember Betsy very well. And I want to begin by talking a little bit about the evolution of writing this particular book. It's a history, in a way, written kind of like a novel, but it uses the actual documents from the family collections of Betsy's family, the Collin family, who settled in Fayetteville the winter of 1816, 1817. I came to do this book when I was getting my MLS. I was told before I went into the library school that Anshe might be retiring soon. It took several years for her to get around to it, but I decided I liked her so much I wanted to take all the courses that she offered. And when I was in her archives class, we all had to do field work. And that meant going to a place like the Historical Association or museums or something like that to learn how to do archival work, how to organize collections and everything. And that's what everybody ran out to do, and I was not that familiar with Syracuse in those days, so I didn't know quite what some of my options were. And this woman came into the class who was a friend of Ancha's. And this was up in the old, when the 1916 room was up on the 6th floor, and the seminar room. She came in and sat down and began to explain how her family had this terrific cache of documents and artifacts. She somehow managed to terrify the classroom. She was a very tough woman, didn't tolerate fools lightly, and no one thought they were going to be interested in helping her. There was an enormous collection of materials, as she explained it. There were 7 generations, I think, several generations at any rate, of family, all of whom kept diaries, wrote letters to one another. There were accurate farm records, and just an enormous amount of material. And she wanted to put it in some kind of order during her retirement and then donate it to the Historical Association. And she needed help putting it together. And for some inexplicable reason, I raised my hand and volunteered. And I think one of my motivations was not only because she was a friend of Ancha's, with whom I felt very close and saw as a mentor, but Ancha had given us this sense that librarians are keepers of the human endeavor. And the breadth of activities and impact of the Collin family in this particular region was pretty impressive. And I thought working to save original documents on behalf of the community at large was an important kind of work to do. I'd also learn a lot about local history. And I ended up doing a lot of work at her home and a lot of work at the Historical Association. And we became very close friends. When I finished my assignment, we moved on to, I continued working with her even after I left library school and began working here at the university. We worked for many years. She became like a third grandmother to our children. When she was in her last years, when she was very ill, I promised her that someday I'd write a book about her family using these documents. And so this is my fulfillment of that promise. I want to read to you a little bit about Betsy for those of you who don't know her or didn't know her. She was born in 1810 in Fayetteville. She was a 1932 graduate of Smith. In fact, her ancestors were among the first women to go to Smith College. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa. She was actively involved in educating women about the political world most of her life. During the early 1930s, she was president of the Onondaga County League of Women Voters. She studied political science and economics here at Syracuse at Maxwell, and was employed in the Works Progress Administration in Washington as a municipal finance analyst. And in 1937, she joined the National League of Women Voters staff. During World War II, she was an administrative analyst for the U.S. Bureau of the Budget, becoming the first woman to help draft the national budget. And they could probably use her today. In 1949, she was sent to Germany to take part in the Reconstruction program as a women's affair consultant under the High Command as a cultural officer in the Foreign Service and the State Department. And this is, I'm quoting in part from the family genealogy about Betsy because it gives a more accurate picture than I can sort of describe off the top of my head. And this part is particularly pertinent to library associates. Arriving in Germany without any knowledge of the language, written or spoken, on her first day she was asked to prepare a budget by noon of that day for the bureau that she intended to create. With her German counterpart, who knew only 14 English nouns and 1 verb, a budget was prepared and they established a bureau which exists today. Now, this counterpart was Ancha Lemke, daughter of the theologian Rudolf Bultmann, who with the rest of her family risked her life to aid Jews escaping the Nazis. Following her return to Syracuse area, Betsy worked at Cornell University on a program to encourage the participation of labor in the Syracuse and Utica areas in civic affairs. She also planned and directed a study of Onondaga County, known as Know Your Onondaga County. She got her master's degree late in life, in her 40s, which is about when I got mine, here at Syracuse in 1957, and she was circulation manager at the Syracuse University Library until 1967. During the 60s, she organized the Syracuse World Affairs Council, which was an extremely popular seminar, and she also started the adult education program for community leaders called Government in Action, which was sponsored, of course, by the League of Women Voters in Syracuse. And she was also a librarian at the Maxwell School of Citizenship. And I've been told that she had a lot to do with managing the process of moving things from the Carnegie Library here to Byrd. I don't have any documentation to prove that, but library staff who were here at the time say that was the case. Now, you have to picture this collection of, it's very well organized down at the Historical Association, but it's not just papers. It's dresses and desks and paintings and many, many photographs. And in 1987, I believe it was, there was a major exhibition down at OHA using all of these documents. And it was the first major exhibition of this kind of one family's papers in many, many years down there, just as the OHA was going through a kind of revival. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the book. These elements I told you about Betsy inform some of the decisions I made of what kind of documents I selected. I constructed the book to be like a novel. So you can follow two threads of a plot weaving together through the entire story. And one of the threads was very interesting. As I was helping Betsy, there was a tradition in the family that one branch of the family, Betsy's, would not talk to another branch of the family, the Armstrong family. Now, Ham Armstrong may be known to some of you. He's a notorious citizen of Fayetteville. He lives on a farm up above Green Lakes. Now, the family used to own as farm land, all of what is now Green Lake State Park. It was taken over by right of eminent domain in the 1930s. Betsy and Ham never really knew why they didn't speak to one another. It had been over a century, and Betsy figured there must be some reason for this, and while we were working on the papers, we discovered what it was. And telling this story is one of the threads that I follow through. And it's a very King Lear-like story, where Ham Armstrong's great-grandmother, Miriam, tried to have her father declared insane to invalidate his will, because she was going to be cut out of the will. The family had become quite well-to-do, and she wanted a bit of the loot. But we didn't know how this had happened, and among the papers was a trial transcript where she, after her father's death, tried to sue her brother to have the will turned over. And the story has it that her brother found out about this when he's coming home one day from a visit in Syracuse. A friend of the family mentioned to him that a bunch of cousins and his sister were gathering over at one of the other family farms that were in the area, and that his father was over there. His father was in his 80s at the time. He lived to be into his 90s, which was considerable age in those days. And David Collin Jr. knew something was up, so he jumped back in his buggy and raced off to his other sister's farm and got his father and brought him back. Because what Miriam had done is gotten her father there under false pretenses, was going to have two doctors coming in from a mental institution in Utica, which is now Marcy State, and have him declared insane and invalidate the will. Well, this was the skeleton in the closet, and it's a very King Lear-like story where one daughter feels betrayed and then tries to betray her father in return. And I weave this narrative through part of the book. The other thread that I weave through is this wonderful romance between two cousins. The Collin family was a large extended family that extended from Columbia County near the Canadian border all the way across to the Finger Lakes. They had some 20 or 30,000 acres of farmland scattered across the state. And there was a lot of intermarriage between first cousins. And these two cousins who were very much in love with one another were double first cousins, and that kind of complicated the possibility of marriage. They were also two of the most popular and brightest of all the cousins, of the many, many cousins in this particular family. Whenever they would turn up at a party or at a holiday, the diaries and letters from that time say, oh, Cardera showed up, and we had such a wonderful time. And everyone is happy and having a party, and when Roswell or Cardera turned up, it made things even better. So they made a pact with one another never to marry while the other one was alive. And this is something they held until one of them, in fact, died in his 40s. It makes a very Romeo and Juliet kind of narrative, because added to the mix was, this was Cardera Cullen and Roswell Cullen, and Roswell's college roommate from Williams College also loved Cardera. But he was Roswell's best friend. And the trio managed to kind of keep this romance going between the three of them for some 25 or 30 years. The friend kept proposing to Cardera. She kept turning him down until Roswell died. So that gives you kind of an overview of how the book is structured and some of the main events that occur in it. What I'd like to do now is read to you some pieces of it to give you a flavor of how the kind of documents that are in it, because I allow the people in the family to tell their own story. There are a couple of places where I add some what you might call fictional elements, where in order to keep the narrative of the story going along, I try to project the idea of what was going on in the heads of the people in this particular moment. And of course, there's no way I could have known exactly what was going on in their heads, and I make that very clear in the book and in the introduction that I do this 2 or 3 times throughout the book. But I know enough about the people and what was going on from their letters and their diaries to have a pretty good guess of what was going on in their heads. And so I'm asking you to put aside your disbelief for a moment as you're reading that and accept that this is more or less the kind of thing that was happening, because it does push the narrative along and makes it read a little more like a novel instead of dry as dust history. So, some of the elements I want to describe to you, or read to you. One of them is something I call the Indian story. When they moved out here in 1816, Fayetteville was Manlius Four Corners, and there wasn't a whole lot out there. There was a lot of virgin forest. David Cullen had inherited 500 acres through the military tract, and it was all woods, and he had to somehow turn it into a farm. They had a cabin built for themselves, and in that first winter they were there, it was just a 3-room cabin, a bit of a loft, and 2 rooms downstairs. And they had to encounter the various things of the wilderness. And I'm going to be reading from this first section from a chronicle that was put together by various aunts and cousins for the 100th anniversary of their marriage in 1816. And this is written by Miriam. Actually, it was written on the occasion of the 50th anniversary. But it gives you an idea of the kind of things that they experienced. My mother had a fear of Indians, reading of the Wyoming massacre. And Wyoming is not out west, but in northern Pennsylvania. In July 1778, the Iroquois and British troops destroyed the settlement of Wyoming. And by the time David and Anna had settled in Manlius Four Corners, the Iroquois had come through a period of terrible cultural dissolution to a new revival and revision of the traditional ways under the teaching of the prophet Handsome Lake. So that's my little aside there. This first winter, I think, just at evening time, a band of young Indians, 18 in number, came to the door asking for lodging for the night. I have to picture this young woman, just newly married, in the middle of nowhere, with 18 Iroquois armed at her front door. It's not quite like the Jehovah's Witnesses coming with a couple of Bibles. Father dared not refuse, knowing the memory of kindness never fades with these children of the forest. Quickly they saw the young wife's fear, or felt it in the atmosphere, their quick occult faculties reading it clearly. At once they walked up to my father, handing him their guns, having returned from a long hunt. He opened the door of the bedroom, which would not close, and put the guns in a corner of the little room. The warriors at once lay themselves upon the floor with their feet to the fire, falling peacefully asleep. Early, my parents awoke to find the guns and their owners had folded their blankets like the Arabs and as quietly stolen away. Thereafter, there was never a heartbeat of fear, but a most kindly welcome to the Indians and squaws, with their papooses bound straight upon a board, which had its carved arch over the head to carry the child by, some very artistically done. These natives of the soil were at home in the wood. And north of the house, upon the hill, east was a rocky ledge, a square, long oven, which the Indians told my mother they baked their bread in years ago. And Betsy's farm, out in Fayetteville, is called Indian Oven Farm. And every summer she would have a picnic up by this rock formation that they used as an oven. Where the family homestead existed, the main house burnt down in 1926, is where Signal Hill is. If you go out on Route 5, there's a housing development there now, or condominium development called Signal Hill, and that's where the big house used to be. Another anecdote from that time, after they'd moved, after 7 or so years in this cabin, they built the big house and they moved into it. And David Collins Sr., who settled in Fayetteville in 1816, became poor master of the village. And this describes you a little bit what the kind of thing that the poor master did. This is a section I call the Mad Frenchman. The town or country had at this time few poor dependent upon charity, and no poorhouse. My father was poor master about 1826. People about would take for a small consideration one or more of the needy, helpless, to board. There were no insane asylums, although Utica was to have one in a few years. Among the suffering was a refined, polished Frenchman, insane, that no one would receive. My father assumed the care, placing him in the west chamber, my mother often taking him his meals. The one constant refrain he repeated continually was, "I never killed anybody." His name was Lafarge, I believe. And one day he thrust his fork into his side without any serious injury. And another time he followed the one who took him his meal through the door, quickly slipping by, and he jumped over the banister. The imprint of the fall remained ever after upon the baseboard. Then he was removed to the wash or workroom, the neighbors dropping in to cheer and chat with the unfortunate exile. He had doubtless observed the well curb in passing, and without a word, one day, slipping by the incomer, he took 3 long jumps over the walk and leapt into the fatal 75-foot drop to the bottom of the well. My mother's surface, the shock to my mother's nervous system induced prostration and indeed never left her. Now, we sometimes forget that how much work went into settling a community, and how much work that it's easy to imagine, rather, that what the men did, clearing 500 acres of forest, plowing the land, cutting the wood, building up herds, planting crops. It's something that our minds can get our hands around. But we often forget what the women had to do when this was all going on. And sort of concurrent with the men, the labor was intensive. And in fact, they had to work with a large open hearth to do most of their cooking and preparing of things. And many women almost never left this position, hour after hour, day after day. And this is also from the Family Chronicle. It gives you an idea of the sort of things that women had to be engaged in. Also remember, they not only had to feed a large family, the Collins ended up having some 6 children, they also had to feed the farmhands. And in the autumn in particular, they might have normally maybe a dozen farmhands or half a dozen farmhands around, but in the autumn for harvest they could have 20 or 30 around. And they had to feed them lunch and sometimes supper, take meals out to the fields if they were out harvesting. And all of this stuff had to be prepared, as well as the other chores that were necessary ongoing in the fall. So this is Miriam again talking about this kind of work. This all involved unworded toil within. Not strange that my mother, after a nervous shock, should have been physically overworked. The early breakfast cooking was done by and over a great kitchen fire, and in the brick oven an open tin baker before the blazing heat. Yet never was there such sweet cream breakfast biscuits eaten, or so light toothsome raised fried cakes, pies innumerable, bread kneaded in the great bread trough to its capacity, filling the mouth of the deep oven, so tender, sweet, and tasty. Then the great iron dinner pot upon the crane, holding 4 or 5 pails full, with its chicken pot pie tossing, bubbling to lift the cover, well seasoned with a generous 2/3 of a roll of golden butter. The cooking for the multitude involved constant labor under the sun and by candlelight far into the night. Indeed, the women of the family and the female help rarely left the fireplace or workroom for days on end. Hours were not limited by laborers to 8, 10, or 12 a day. The laborers only earned about 50 cents a day, or something like $8 or $10 in our money, for the same in food and supplies, and that was the normal wage. Sometimes a pork from the packing of 18 or 20 pigs, all fatted on corn. One of the hands, Van Zandt, had charge of feeding, and he used to say he fed them with a spoon, when at last they could not rise to eat, and then they would be slaughtered. Smoked hams or shoulders, beef, lamb, mutton, wheat, or corn flour. There was no market in those early days, but there were the herds, fresh fat to draw from. And in summer, besides the 3 full meals, there were morning and afternoon luncheon to set out. Often dinner and lunch were packed for farm hands. And they had to be marched through the wheat fields with cradles swinging. If you can imagine someone with a yoke carrying buckets of food along to the farmhands. It's like a painting by Bruegel. It's also, this is as much as I'm going to read of that, but I want to also add the kind of other labors they were engaged in, because everything that they needed, they had to do and make for themselves. They had to make soap. And soap was not an easy thing to make by using fat from the animals and with lye to create the soap. They had to make their own candles from beeswax. They had to have raised their own bees in order to get the beeswax. And candles were their only light. And you know how long the winters are around here. They needed a lot of candles. They had to do their own spinning and weaving. They had to deal with the gardens to raise their vegetables and herbs for health, because there weren't any doctors running around. They had child care. They had to make preserves and put up meats and vegetables. They had to deal with the honey. They had to render the syrup, and on and on and on. Also for the women, and I'm emphasizing the women here because, as I say, it's easier to picture the men's side of wilderness settlement. Life for the women in the early days in particular was extremely lonely. Ink, pen, and paper were rare and precious commodities. And I have here a few letters from David and his brother came out to settle this in 1816, as I said, and his brother Henry went further out to Benton in the Finger Lakes. And his wife, Nancy Collin, and from her letters I get the title of the book, because she frequently closed her letters after lamenting about how difficult life was. So I hope to see you perhaps in the fall, if our lives be spared. And this was not an uncommon closing to letters, because these people face death in ways that we can't even imagine every day. Death in childbirth, early childhood death was quite common. And diseases that we don't even think about anymore that have been virtually eradicated were murderous. Measles, for example. Who thinks about measles? But it was a real killer. Typhoid was the greatest killer of all. Nancy Collin was out in the Finger Lakes all alone, feeling pretty desperate, trying to raise a family. And here are some letters home from her. Dear sisters, I must write a line to you and tell you I have not forgot you through all the cares and love of my family, and my thoughts are winged to you. I think I can never become wholly reconciled to think we must spend our lives so far from each other. I anticipate great happiness visiting Hillsdale next fall. Harry says he shall come in the fall if we are well. I hope we shall not be disappointed. I often count the months to come before we shall see each other and converse together. But alas, how fleeting is this life! We may some of us be laid low in the dust before that time. I felt an anxious desire that we may all live to see each other again. I shall omit writing lengthy, thinking the time will not be long before we shall see one another. My pen is so poor I must stop, and if you read this, you'll do well. I calculate to take both of my children with me when I come. Give my love to Father Collin and the family, if our lives be spared. Harriet Ann talks a great deal about Grandmammy Collin, and you must write soon. And I close, Nancy Abigail Collin, May 10th, 1821. And posted in the same letter to her brother, she writes, I once more take pen in hand to write to you, to let you know that I and my family are enjoying tolerable health at present, and I think we have reason to be thankful for it, and it has become a dying time about this neighborhood. There has been 11 deaths within a mile east and west of us in about the last 2 years. Cole died last week, and the week before, a young man on the hill this side of Mr. Cole's with the measles. I have attended his father and his mother's funerals and his. It was real and affecting time. He died happy, it was thought, and he said he was going to heaven to meet his father and mother. The measles have been very thick about here and go very hard. My children have not had them yet, and I expect they will, and we have not heard anything from you since Father Colin was here. I want to hear, some of the spelling here is very interesting, and I might misread it. I want to hear from you all very much. Uncle Keeper lives with Henry, and he lives in our place, and yet Walter lives 6 miles from here, but they are all well, I believe. I shall write short, and I expect if we are spared with life and health to see you next fall, and then I can tell you more than I can write. Give my love to Father and Mother, and Aunt Griselle, and all the friends. Nancy Collin, May 10th, 1821. So this kind of gives you a picture of the background setting as the family began to develop and really settle in. Now, one of the treasures of this collection are the papers of the young Roswell Collin. He's the one who was in love with his dear cousin, his double cousin. And he started keeping a diary when he was 7 years old. And I want to read you some of those early excerpts because it gives you an idea of what life was like on the farm, gives you a boy's perspective of the universe, and it's really quite wonderful, as I think you'll see. This is from Christmas, December 28th, 1859. He was 7 years old. David and Edward got Charlie and I to go to bed, and David put 1 cent in my stockings, and I had a pair of mittens. In the afternoon, we went up to Manlius at Smith Hall. We went in an old room that looked as if it had been an old store. Then we went up 3 pairs of stairs. Then we went into a large room where there was a large table with cakes, candies, apples, grapes, nuts, and a great many nice things. We had the Manlius band real near us, and when we was coming home, the road was very bare, and we had to go on the side of the road because they were in a sled rather than in a wagon. It was very slanting, and most of the weight was on one side, and the sled turned over. 18 in it. It was a bobsled. It had no reach to hold it together, and the front part was drawn out from the box. It went over very slow, and no one was hurt. We got the box on the 2 sleighs and got in again, but Peter and John Rowe ran and got David's sleigh, and we rode home. When we got home, it was very nearly dark. I'd done my chores. I am so tired that I think I have rode enough, and so good night. And the next day, he writes, we had a very nice time up to Manlius at Smith's Hall, and I was so tired that I did not finish telling about it when I was up to in Manlius. First, the band played, then Mr. Little talked to us, and then the melodeon played, and the people sang. And at the same time, there was a Christmas tree standing on a stand, and there was a great many little red apples around it, and I think it was one of the nicest times I ever had before, and now I'm going to bed. A couple years later, 1861, he's 9 years old, and he writes this. This morning I got up and put on my pants, spelled P-A-N-C-E, put on my pants alone. Before the boys went to school, Eddie gave me some cedar to whittle, and I made a water wheel and 2 watches and a scraper. The water wheel I brought out into the kitchen, and I set it in motion. And this morning I made 5 large watches, kind of a disc where he would draw the face of the watch on it. I made 5 large watches, and this afternoon I made 2 large ones. In the evening, Mr. Edward Flint came in and took tea with us, and after went down to the concert with Mother, Mary, David, Father, Clara, and Eddie, and Margaret, Hattie, Charlie, Minnie, Willie, and myself. We cut up little sticks and had them for saw logs, and we played that the water wheel was a sawmill, and I made a little sleigh, and in the morning I sold it to Hattie for 15 butternuts. Now, those of you who have had children, I'm sure have had them complain about having to wash the dishes after supper or feed the dog or take the trash out. Well, this is what an 11-year-old boy had to do in 1864. This morning, Emma was up downstairs when I got up and came down, and we bid each other good morning, and then I went out about my chores. Emma and I are just exactly the same height, and her birthday is the 16th of February and mine the 4th of January. Fred went down to the barn with us boys to do our chores. Eddie milks 3 cows and feeds 2 little calves mornings. Charlie and I have to feed the colts, feed the cattle, and I have to feed the 3 cows that Eddie milks and with wheat and bran and fill them up. I fill up the wood box and feed the pigs, sort apples and potatoes. And at nights, one night I have to feed the cows corn stalks, and the next night I have to shell a basket of corn and take it over to the other barn for Father to feed the sheep the next morning, getting kindling wood and so forth. That's just some of it, because he had other major tasks to do. And there's one selection of the diaries when he's a little bit older where he has to muck out the barn and shovel manure into the fields. Unlike many farmers, the Collins were very smart farmers. They rotated their crops and they fertilized their fields. A lot of folks who came here through New England would farm out the land and literally burn out the soil and then move on to richer places out in Ohio and for points west. So what he had to do in this particular run of the diaries is that today I had to go out and spread manure. Next day, more manure. And this goes on for a week. More manure, more manure, more manure. He found it pretty dull work. In April 1865, he has some very interesting things to write in his diary. I think this is particularly interesting because we all know the story from our history books. This is from someone literally experiencing it at the time. Good news. 2 weeks ago, last Monday, General Grant and his armies took Richmond and Petersburg, both the same day, with terrible fighting of nearly a week. The cannons have been firing all day, and the bells ring very fast and loud in all the villages and cities around us. There is very great rejoicing. The cannons begun firing at midnight and fired till 12 o'clock the next night. The last day of March, Friday evening, we had a party here, and there was about 25 here, I guess, and we played Whirl the Platter and oats, peas, beans, and barley grows, spat, and then came and had supper and had some maple candy, and some of them sugared theirs off. They all seemed to enjoy it very much. Terrible news. Last Friday evening, President Lincoln was at a theater, and a man came up behind him and shot him with a pistol in the back of the head and got away on horseback. Another man at the same time went to the Secretary Seward's house and stabbed him 2 or 3 times in the neck and knocked him down and stabbed him 3 or 4 others and got away on horseback. None of Mr. Seward's arteries were cut, and perhaps he may get well. Mr. Lincoln was insensible all of the time after it, and they thought he was dead, but he lived until 22 minutes after 7 o'clock the next morning and then died. I was out in the lot rolling in the barley, and Hattie came out and told me the news. Father went out to Syracuse a few days ago and got Charlie and I each a nice little flag, and we trimmed them with black and hung them out. In the village, almost every house was trimmed with black. The bells were tolling then instead of ringing. April 9th, General Lee surrendered his whole army to Grant. The officers and men were paroled and went home. The bells commenced ringing about 10 o'clock in the forenoon, and the cannons firing very fast. The first part of the week there was great rejoicing, and the last part, great mourning. What a week! All the stores were shut last Saturday, and in the city too. One of the sections of the book that I have, an extended selections of diaries about the Civil War. There were 3 members of the family that fought in the war, not of the immediate Fayetteville family, although Betsy's grandfather did, and actually his are some of the most exciting diaries in the family paper, because he fought in the front. He was in a town under siege called Washington in North Carolina, and he was there at the siege of Richmond and Washington, D.C., breaking the siege of those cities. And he's under gunfire, under cannon fire, and it's quite dramatic. Another member of the family who was out in the Finger Lakes area was a quartermaster and spent an awful lot of time behind the scenes. But you get a great sense of what it was like to feed an army. Napoleon said an army moves on its stomach, and you get a really sense of how they had to do that and why Many of the farms and the lands that the Army went through were devastated because they needed all the cows and pigs and everything else they could get their hands on in order to feed the armies. I want to read you two last things to give you a different perspective on the story. Roswell, this guy who wrote these diaries as a young boy, continued writing throughout his life. He became a doctor. He finished up at Williams College and went to Columbia Medical School, and he became a leading throat specialist in New York City. And he still beloved his cousin. He still loved his friend Charlie, who loved his cousin as well. And he had a summer practice out in what is now the Hamptons in Long Island, and a place called Quogue. And while he was there, he treated a young boy, a young black boy, for typhoid, and contracted it himself. And this was a real serious matter, because this was some couple of decades before Typhoid Mary led to the discovery or caused typhoid and some cure for it. So this is what I call Roswell's last letter. It wasn't literally his last letter, but shortly after this, when he became ill, he didn't write very much. And he died in his early 40s as a result. But this was a real surprise for me to find this letter. It gives what I consider a Buddhist perspective on history. And to me, it was a wonderful opportunity to find this idea that I had about the nature of history documented in the collection itself. He's writing to his friend Charlie, the part of this wonderful trio. The beach episode, he writes, was an accident, pure and simple, without one element of imprudence. We were unusually cautious, as the lifelines were not out. The same condition, because he nearly drowned when he was out swimming, is what it amounts to. The same conditions now as the lines are out would be free from danger, as the sea pull would simply sweep us to the cross line where we could all cling and rest and come in on the ropes if we could do no better. As to the other dangerous case which exhausted me, I have not the slightest regret except that I could not save the little black stalwart bit of humanity. I would not only do the same thing again, but I would do it all or more with genuine pleasure. In fact, I could not possibly do otherwise. When once a life is committed to my hands, I am impelled by a force as irresistible as the fatal magnetism which draws one to the brink of a giddy precipice or height. It may be fatal, one may topple over the edge, but be powerless to prevent it all the same. Old soldiers prefer to meet death on the field. So would I, in the service, when my call comes. My life is not so precious to me that I would not become a coward to save it. Desperate cases make me desperate. Still more, it is what I like to do. It gives me pleasure, and I have none too much these days. My greatest interest and pleasure in life is in my work. It may exhaust me, but it brings me no pain or bitterness or sorrow or fear. It did once, but never since. Of all diseases in the world, I had the greatest dread and horror of smallpox. When it became my duty as well as opportunity to take charge of the smallpox hospital, I was almost paralyzed with fear. I had a fearful battle to fight my cowardice, but pride and conscience won the day, and I entered the wards prepared to do my duty at whatever cost. Since that time, disease has had no terror for me, and this case was worse than smallpox. It might have cost me my life, but I do not think I would have minded very much if it had. Experience has taught me well the lesson which probably most people of my age learn: blessed be nothing. The early hopes and ambitions for personal happiness are most seductive, but they are frauds and sure to fail. One may plan his own plans, exercise without limit the privileges of free agency, and attain his ends, all of which were motivated by a craving, natural enough, but most likely selfish, for satisfaction and happiness. But when all is done, some subtle influence has spirited away the object of it all, and only vanity or mockery are left. There is no happiness. One is crushed. It is better to be crushed early, as you and I have been, than to be educated by fortune to an elevation of high certainty, and then let drop like a charred rocket stick. I believe this is the great lesson of life, and that the sooner one learns it, the better. It seems like the end of all things, but it isn't. It seems to bereave June of all its roses, the sunlight of its glory, music of its harmony, and life of everything it seemed and promised. It is a very large, nasty old school dose. It cannot be swallowed all at once. But it is finally injected, assimilated, and as a result, self, or selfishness, is largely eliminated. The bottom seems knocked out of everything, and one expects nothing. Well, the truth is, that is just the time one begins to live. The ego had to be pulverized, and when practically extinct, the weak remnants first revived to a consciousness that if nothing is not blessed, it is at least tolerable. By way of relief, ego begins to take interest in others, since there is not enough left of itself to interest anything or anybody. It is not so bad, in fact, rather agreeable. What fools we mortals be to take all that time and suffering to learn what we were taught in the beginning. I find all my plans for my personal pleasure disappointing. When I forget myself and turn to others helpfully, I find that by some curious necromancy, I attain the greatest satisfaction. And last, to follow this, I'd like to read my conclusion to the book, which gives you, I think, a Buddhist perspective on history that I drew from this last letter of Roswell Collin. And in a sense, it sums the whole picture I have of the book in general. When we try to understand the transformation that took place in the nature of Roswell Collin, both in the context of his extended family and in the context of the unremitting demands of his work, we arrive at a place where metaphysics, morals, and the down-to-earth, bare-handed experience of life come together. Of the two themes that weave the fugue-like nature of this story, Roswell's gives color to both, revealing the finite limits of the moral tragedy of the one while surrounding the whole with a possibility found through the cleansing fire of love lost and the selfless attention to the details of daily life itself. Even as a boy, Roswell, as his diaries show, observed the world closely, inclusively, and with respect. It is said it is not perfection that life requires, but completeness, and that everything, each one of us, is the condition by which all else exists. Thus Roswell's legacy. There is a metaphor that directly addresses this seeming paradox of the timeless within time, a finite individuation of the personal simultaneously resting with the infinite. The sea represents in our imagination our inner sense of the infinite universe. Imagine being on the shore. We can stand in the shallow water and watch each wave as it moves towards us. We see that each of these waves is unique, has its own personality. But then they crash and disappear. Where do they go? The ocean does not diminish when the wave vanishes, nor is the wave apart from the ocean while it rolls toward us. Any particular wave has a life and time of its own on its path towards the shore. But the ocean itself remains constant and unchanged by either the coming or going of the wave or by the time it takes for the wave to reach us. As we glance back over our shoulders into those living ways which make up the selective narrative of the Collin family, we find it is possible to realize a kind of interbeing with Roswell's nothing, a conscious state in which everything reflects everything else, while also seeing, as Roswell always did, that everything remains itself and that every journey has neither beginning nor end. Because we can remember the true stories as they come to us, we cannot, in some deep way, finally die. If we can learn that everything is still around, we can also learn to live those stories that will help life to continue to emerge between stasis and chaos. Roswell left his stories behind, becoming free by letting go of his history, his ties, and living wholly in the ever-emerging now. The tragedy of Miriam Collin is that she could not let go and so became trapped by the very conditions she had created for herself. Thus, the true story of life is without a story. In the end, one gives up everything, even one's God, and has it all. This is the great paradox to which we are all heir. The end.